Uh, okay. Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to tell you what an honor it is to speak to this group, particularly about the subjects that's near and dear to me, which is the issues of wrongful convictions and exonerations and the Innocence Project. And to start out, I'd like to ask all of you just for a moment to imagine that you're sitting at home, it's a Sunday night, and at 8 o'clock there's a knock at the door, and it's a police officer, and he tells you about that there's been a murder in the neighborhood, and the next thing you know, you're being arrested for having committed that murder that you knew nothing about. And you're taken to the police station, processed, and ultimately you think to yourself, well, this is going to be okay, this is going to work out, because when I go to trial, they have no evidence against me because I didn't even know about this murder. And so you then go to trial. And after the trial, the jury comes back and their finding is guilty. And so then there is a proceeding with regard to sentencing. Now imagine yourself sitting there. You've gone through this trial, you've been found guilty of something you had nothing to do with, and the judge then decrees that—
So what did you want to tell me?
Decrees that the—
Sarah said they're coming to pick up.
the judge decrees the death sentence, the death penalty. If you've imagined this, you think to yourself, you can't help but think to yourself that this can't happen. It just can't happen. But the truth is that it happened not only to Sonny Jacobs, who is going to be your speaker today, and Peter Pringle, both of them not involved in the murders they were arrested for, tried for, and convicted and sentenced to death for. Both of them were totally innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted. When we talk about exonerated, or what the Innocence Projects do, basically it's a legal process by which a person, contrary to the original trial, the person has, the defendant has the burden of proof of proving that he or she is actually innocent. Actually innocent. That's actual innocence is the critical point there. And it usually happens in almost every case long after the defendant has been convicted and has undergone exhausted all of his appeals. And it's usually years later. In the case of Sonny and Peter, we're talking decades later. And so it's not something that happens right away. It happens, and it's based upon finding new evidence that proves actual innocence. Now, just to put this all in context, in the past 30 years in the United States, 2,891, as of today, 2,891 people have been exonerated. Those are people who have spent years and years, decades, some of them as many as 45 years in prison for for crimes they did not commit. Incredibly, of that 2,891 exonerees, 135 of them were actually on death row. Those are people who, if the process had gone through, would have been executed wrongfully. We know of a number of people that have been wrongfully executed, and Sonny will talk of one when she speaks. And so keeping this in context, knowing the number of people who have been exonerated, they have computed the probable number of people in prison today who actually did not commit the crimes that they're in prison for. And the minimum number, the most conservative estimates say 20,000 people are in prison in the United States for serious crimes they did not commit. The more reasonable number is close to 60 to 70,000 people. Now, I know you didn't come to hear me. You came to hear Peter, and you came to hear Sonny. And so and my wife always says to me, Larry, stop talking, because when I start going on wrongful convictions, it's hard to turn off. But unfortunately, I found out this morning that Peter, who was going to be our first speaker, Peter is unfortunately in the hospital for a procedure. He's doing fine, but he's obviously unable to join us today. But I thought, in fairness, I should at least share something by Peter. And there was a talk that he gave actually in the courthouse that he was convicted in. This was not too long ago. Gave a talk in the courthouse where he was convicted in. It's 8 minutes long. I'm going to share that with you, and then I'm going to introduce Sonny, who actually is on the screen at this point. So I'm going to hopefully be able to pull this up. Let's see.
I've been thinking as I was listening to all the speakers, and wonderful speakers and musicians, how this building for centuries has represented repression and violence and subjugation of people. And somehow this evening it comes to me that the whole essence of this building is being changed, because this evening it's filled with love and caring and a wonderful sense of community, which I think actually is what this building originally must have been actually intended for. 32 years ago yesterday, I was sitting beside Susan there in the dock when I was sentenced to death for a crime I didn't commit. And coming here this evening has been a hugely emotional experience for me. I actually went down the stairs and into the holding cell to re-experience that. And I showed Sonny, my wife, Sonny Jacobs, is here with me, where it was. And in the middle of my trial, a police officer, a Garda, who had 2 days after the original crime attempted to arrest the person whom they claimed was me, and actually was within arm's reach of that person, only he got away from him, sat there in the witness box where Claire sits. And when he was asked could he identify that person, he pointed to a man standing at the back of the public gallery up there. And he says, "That's him standing up there." Nevertheless, I was convicted. And I was told by the judge that the sentence was read that I was to be made to suffer death by execution in the manner prescribed by law. And several years later, in my study of law, I discovered that there was actually no manner prescribed by law by which they could have executed me. In plain, simple language, there was no legal method provided by which they could have hanged me, although they sentenced me to death and held me in a death cell. And 11 days before my sentence I was due to be hanged, they commuted that sentence to 40 years in prison without remission. And the two men who were convicted with me are still in prison, 32 years later. And I'm fully convinced that they have been in unlawful custody since 1980 and remain in unlawful custody to this day. I hope whenever I get my case to the court that I will be able to show that. And that's a little mission I have. But I do it through my lawyers now. I don't do it on my own behalf. At first I used to do. But I had to learn when I came out of prison that anger and bitterness were not emotions that were good for me. They were not emotions, they're justified emotions, and we all have them at times, and we're entitled to them. But you know, the holding of anger only harms me. The holding of bitterness only harms me. And I had to bring myself, and I did so through yoga and meditation, to a point where I could be in a spirit of forgiveness of the people who wrongfully sent me to prison. And when I arrived at that position in my life, I suddenly was free. I was free of the whole thing. And so I met, very, very fortunately, 3 years after I came out of prison, I met Sonny Jacobs. And Sonny had been 17 years wrongly imprisoned in the state of Florida in America. She spent 5 years in solitary confinement in a death cell under sentence of death, where nobody was allowed to speak to her, where she was allowed out of her cell twice a week for 20 minutes, so she could have a shower and a little walk in the courtyard accompanied by a jailer, and put back into her cell again. And whilst in her cell, she changed that cell into her sanctuary. She found within herself the strength and the means for that strength, namely again yoga and meditation, by which she was able to survive and come out a whole person and a better person. And so when eventually I met Sonny, who was invited here to Ireland by the Irish section of Amnesty, and there's a chap here who actually was in Texas on the occasion when she was invited. And we met and we shared our story with each other. We were astonished to find that we had both used the same disciplines to get us through our ordeals, namely yoga and meditation. But we also found out, when we discussed our cases with each other, that the face of injustice is the same everywhere. And since then, we've traveled the world speaking on for human rights and the abolition of the death penalty, even as far away as Kazakhstan. And we find the same thing everywhere, that the face of injustice is the same. And you know, sometimes when we're giving a talk, somebody will say to us, "But what about justice?" And Sonny has this lovely way of answering that. She says, "There is no justice. There is just us." And she doesn't mean just us, she and I. She means just us, all of us. Because collectively, we can make justice. But if we leave it to other people to administer justice on our behalf and don't have the proper checks and balances to see that they do it in accordance with the correct way, we're going to get injustice. And that's part of the problem of our society. And I sometimes think, and I say, that actually, unfortunately, the state is riddled with corruption. Now, when I say corruption, I don't mean necessarily corruption in the sense of fraud or illegality. I mean corruption in the sense that ethics have become corrupted, standards have become corrupted. We're like a nation. I've heard somebody say recently that we're a nation of people who say, sure, it'll do. Sure, it's all right. Sure, it'll get better. And we pass the buck on to somebody else to make the changes that we actually should be making ourselves. Collectively, we can change this country. Collectively, we can be a voice, not just, we are all one single voice within ourselves, but collectively we are a powerful voice that can speak out for justice and equality. And the three missing ingredients that I see in our public life today, which is transparency, equality, and accountability. They're not there, and they should be there. And if they were there, this awful, horrendous scene that happened with the financial situation would not or could not have happened. We can make change, but we have to, within ourselves, change ourselves. This is what I found out when I came out of prison. I had to let go of the anger and the bitterness I had. I had to turn myself towards healing and reconciliation, because that's where my solution is. That's where my salvation is. And Sonny found the same thing. And I would suggest to you that that's where all of our salvations is. Sonny says, and she says it very eloquently when she's asked, she says, in the final analysis, she says, peace is the way and love is the answer. And I endorse that. And I put it to you that that is our way forward. And I thank everyone for being here. Thank you.
So that probably could not be a more eloquent introduction to the next speaker. Before I turn it over to Sonny, who's sitting and waiting, I just wanted to share one other thing with you. Sonny was convicted in the late 70s, and it's been a few years. I want to share with you a picture of Sonny a few years, actually less than a few years, before she was convicted of murder and sentenced to be executed. And that's Sonny with her son. And the insert is a picture of Sonny with her daughter. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sonny.
It's the reverse. It's just the reverse. Mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, okay, you're right. And obviously you're right. And this picture actually I extracted from a wonderful book that was written by Sonny called Stolen Time. And it's the story of her conviction and her life as it occurred. Without further ado, I want to turn this over to Sonny Jacobs.
Thank you. Thanks, Larry. It'll go out of my mind completely if you are interested in the book. Peter has a book as well. They're available on our website, and Larry will give you all that at another time. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for being here. It's sometimes I'm not exactly sure where to begin, especially after Peter gave me such a good intro, actually. But I think sometimes the story is so involved. It's that I have trouble fitting it all into a small amount of time. But I think because we all are share a Florida connection, and we all share a religious connection for the most part, that I think I'll focus on those two areas of the story. As Peter said, we were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death, my husband at the time and I, for the murder of two policemen in Florida. He was sentenced to death and sent to Stark, to the old Florida State Prison, where they have the death row for men. And I was sent to the old women's maximum security prison up in North Florida in the beginning. And I was the only woman with a sentence of death at the time. So they separated me from the population of the prison and put me in a special area that they used to use for, like if there had been a riot or they needed to lock up a lot of women at one time. And it was surrounded by its own barbed wire fence. So no other prisoners were allowed into that area. And I wasn't allowed to have any contact with them. Just to give you some context, my cell was 6 steps from the solid metal door to the toilet sink facility. And then if I reached out my arms like this, I could touch both walls. There was a metal shelf on the left-hand side with a thin mattress and a thin pillow. That was my bed. And that was all. That was all that was in the room, the cell. I didn't have a desk or a chair or anything like that. I was only allowed 2 books, a Bible and a law book. And at the time, the law book was incomprehensible to me. It was another language. And the Bible was a book of wisdom. I wasn't really sure I believed in God anymore. I was brought up Jewish. We did holidays mostly, and my brother was bar mitzvahed and I was supposed to be bat mitzvahed, but that didn't happen. But I went to Hebrew school. And so when I found myself in this situation, I really started to doubt that there was God at all, because how could God let this happen to me and my whole family? When someone is wrongly convicted, it doesn't just happen to them. The whole family suffers from it. My mother said that she didn't sleep a night since I was convicted, worrying that they would come and kill me or that something would happen to me in my little death row. I was the only woman with a sentence of death at that time in the entire United States. There had been about a 3-year moratorium at that point in time. In 1976 is when we had our trial. And there were a few men they had started using the death penalty again. So there were a few men on death row, but there were no women. So that's why I was put in solitary confinement. And so I thought, well, the Bible is a book of wisdom. So I would read the Bible every day. And it always said something that I needed to hear. But there's one particular day, I always wish I remembered what exactly it was that I read, but it told me that they don't get to say when I die. That's not in their power, actually. Even though they did have all the power, it was in writing, and they could keep me locked up in my death cell, that wasn't actually for theirs to say. And in a way, that gave me back my life. And it gave me a power that I thought I didn't have. Because until they realized that they made a mistake and sent me home, or actually did take my life for some karmic reason that I didn't understand, my life still belonged to me. And I didn't have to live it in fear and misery and confusion, which is what they said. Instead, I could use the time that I had, be it long or be it short, to make myself the best person that I could be. Because whichever way it worked, that was the best thing I could do with myself. And so that's what I decided to do. But the only way I could do that is if I believed in hope rather than hopelessness. And without God, my situation was pretty hopeless. So I decided that I would have a conversation with God, which Jewish people are allowed to have directly. And after that, I realized that I wasn't alone the way they wanted me to believe, that really I was never alone. And I began to work on my spiritual self. I turned my cell into a sanctuary, and I did my spiritual work, which I didn't have time for before because I had 2 young children and a husband. My son was 9 years old when this happened. He was held for 2 months in juvenile detention. Why? I was told it was to put pressure on me to say what they wanted me to say. My daughter was only 10 months old. The picture that you saw was just maybe 2 or 3 months before this happened. And she also was held for about 2 weeks until my parents got a judge to release her into their custody. It took, however, the 2 months before my son was released into their custody. And by then he was so traumatized having been taken to interrogation sessions, handcuffed behind his back, 9 years old, without any representation, that by the time my parents were able to get him, he had forgotten how to read or do math, because those were things that we used to do together. And I think it was an emotional thing for him, and he had to be put in special school. After a while, my parents actually had to move because they said even people's sympathy was too painful. There's no help. There is no help for the families of people who are sentenced to death, and especially for people who are wrongfully convicted. In those days, nobody believed there was such a thing as wrongful conviction anyway. Larry can tell you, I mean, in those days, if you were arrested and convicted and sentenced to death, you must have done something. They wouldn't just do that to you. But now we know much different. And that's a story for another time. But so I started working on my spiritual self. The only tools I had were yoga, meditation, and prayer. And that became my trinity. And that's what saved my life truly. And it was that through those three disciplines that I found actually true freedom that I had never known before. And so I spent 5 years sentenced to death until finally my case come up for the first review. And because number one, my court appointed attorney, like Larry said, we didn't do anything. So why should my parents put their house up on a mortgage so that I could have a lawyer when they gave me a lawyer? I don't have nothing to fear. I'll go to court. They'll see me for 5 minutes. They'll know I would never kill anybody. I was a vegetarian, God's sake. I don't even eat meat. I mean, and I was a hippie. Peace and love, that kind. So, I mean, anybody who knew me knew I wouldn't kill anybody. But of course, that was very naive. And so when it came time for my appeal, my court-appointed lawyer said that he wasn't prepared to talk about the death penalty. And in my trial, this is very interesting. In my trial, the jury voted for life because they weren't really convinced of my guilt to begin with. Again, it's too long of a story to tell now, but it's in the book. And so as a result, the judge overruled the jury and sentenced me to death anyway, which in those days they could do legally, but he had to give a proper legal reason in writing for having done so. And he did not. So for those two reasons, they overturned my sentence, but my conviction remained in place and would remain in place for another 12 years. So after the 5 years on death row, I was put into the population of the prison, which to me was a celebration. I could talk to people. I could eat with people. I could go outside, even at night. It was amazing for me. And I talked so much the first 3 days that I lost my voice entirely. But then my life improved greatly because I could, for the first time in over 5 years, I could call my parents. I could talk to my children on the phone. They could only bring the children to visit 4 times a year during school holidays. And it was heartbreaking. So now I could talk to them on the phone. I could go outside in the evenings and I got a set of paints, watercolors, and I could paint the sunsets and use those for my letters to the children and to Jesse, my husband, who had also been wrongly sentenced to death. And his sentence never changed. So at that point, life really improved quite a bit for me. About a year after my sentence was changed from death to life, my parents decided that they were so relieved that they didn't have to worry about me being executed, that they would take one vacation that didn't involve bringing the children to visit in prison. They decided to go to Las Vegas. They left the children home. And unfortunately, the plane crashed and they were killed. And that was the worst day of my life. I saw it on television. I had a dream the night before, a terrible dream, and I tried to call them to warn them, but they were so they left early. They wanted to be on time. The prison didn't know what to do with me. They had never had that happen before. They weren't going to allow me to go to the funeral. But there was a rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Richter. And he had started visiting me actually when I was on death row. And he was my little champion. He came once a month, and it would always be Shabbat. Whenever he came was Shabbat. And we'd have our little Shabbat service, and he'd bring little food. You know, we always have to have food for our celebrations. And so he took up my cause, and he told them that they had to allow me to go to the funeral. And so only really because it took them 2 weeks to identify the remains, whatever remains there were, did we have enough time to campaign, really, to have me go to the funeral. But we were successful, and I was allowed to go to the funeral. And they gave me 5 minutes afterwards to visit with my children and my brother. And then they brought me back to prison. So not only did my children become orphans again, but I became an orphan, which meant there was really nobody outside to make sure that there was somebody fighting my case, that I got a few dollars to be able to buy myself something at the canteen. And life became much more difficult. My children eventually went into foster care. My son, after about 1.5 years, went out on his own, and I lost touch with him. All I could do was to pray that he would be okay. My daughter, who by then was about 7 years old, was taken by her foster family to the state of New York. And for the first year, 1.5 years, they brought her to visit me. But then they said it was too difficult, too stressful for their family to continue to bring her to visit. So the visits stopped, and that's not unusual. And then after a while, they decided the telephone calls also were too disruptive. And so I was cut off from my daughter completely. All during the years, the man who actually did the killing had confessed numerous times, bragging about how he had killed the 2 policemen and he had these other 2 people on death row for what he did. And a few times we were able to get it to court. A couple of times when other prisoners overheard him and came forward. But each time, either it was decided that prisoner's word was unbelievable, unless they're testifying against you, apparently. And he learned to play this game where if he threatened to confess in court, the prosecutor would send a couple of his men to convince him to go back to his original trial testimony. And as a result, he would get a perk. I know of 3. One, he got a better job in the prison. One, he got a change of prisons. And one, he got a TV in his cell. So we didn't prevail. After 15 years, Jesse received his 3rd death warrant. And normally the 3rd death warrant proves fatal, and in his case it was. We were given a brief 10-minute phone call just a couple of hours before. His mother begged and pleaded and got a visit for her and our daughter, an actual visit, not behind the glass. And she never talked about that for many years. It was too private and special for her. And then when Jesse Tefero was taken to the electric chair, the chair malfunctioned. And instead of dying, the witnesses there on behalf of the media said that flames shot out of his head and smoke came out of from underneath the helmet, and that he fought against the restraints, and they had to do this to him 3 times before he was actually pronounced dead by a doctor, and a doctor participates in every execution in order to pronounce the person dead. When our daughter heard about what happened to her father, she was about 15 and a half when this happened. She tried to take her own life. So the foster family, not having any help, decided that the best thing to do would be to put her in a school for children with emotional and behavioral problems, where she was locked up until she was 18 years old. And I wasn't allowed to have any contact with her there. About 2.5 years after Jesse's execution, with the help of my friend Mickey, who was a childhood friend, and her partner Christy, who is an attorney, a civil attorney, but still she knew the law. And Mickey was a documentary filmmaker, so she knew how to do research. And by combining their skills with my then pro bono attorneys, and by the way, I always tell people, if you're going to have to get an appeals attorney, get a young one, because it takes so long to get to the appeals that, in my case, my new appeals attorney died of a heart attack after playing a game of tennis, because he was older, an older person. So you have to have young attorneys if you're going to have an appeal, because it takes so long. So they put their research skills together, and they were able to put together my habeas corpus with illustrations, because Mickey sees things in pictures. And because of the illustrations, the judges were able to see that neither Jesse nor I could have committed the murder. And so, too late for Jesse, but my conviction and sentence and conviction were overturned. But they weren't going to let me go. They weren't going to admit that they made a mistake or that any wrongdoing had taken place. And so they threatened to take me back to a new trial. Now, these days, we know that they don't usually do it. They threaten it because they don't want to have to pay compensation. They don't want to admit that there was any wrongdoing. And so there were hearings being held. And my attorneys, of course, demanded full discovery. They were given 10 boxes of material that we had never seen. 10 boxes. I guess they figured that my pro bono attorneys wouldn't be able to go through 10 boxes of papers in just a few days. I mean, they weren't getting paid by me. They do have to make a living and have other clients. But my friends took a hotel room, and they took those 10 boxes and started going through them. The first thing they found was that there had been a polygraph test given to the actual killer, who had requested to see the prosecutor to make a deal immediately. And he had been given a plea bargain for 3 life sentences in return for his testimony against Jesse and me. But in order to justify that plea bargain, they had to give him a polygraph test to show that they weren't making the deal with the real killer. And they submitted a report that he passed the polygraph test, thereby justifying their deal with him. So Mickey and Christy said, wait a minute, they've done so much else wrong. Why should we believe this report? I want to see the actual graph that came off the machine. So they got a polygraph expert who had been a policeman before, so he wasn't on my side. And when they got a hold of the actual graph that came off the machine, it showed that he didn't pass the polygraph test at all. It showed that he actually lied on the polygraph test when he said that he didn't do it. And we did. Now, that should have been enough to stop the hearings, I think, but it wasn't. So the hearings continued. And then they found that there had been a written statement by a prison guard who had overheard the man bragging about how he had done the killings. Now, had we had possession of the prison guard's testimony, it would have entitled Jesse to a new trial. That apparently was serious enough to stop the hearings. So they made me an offer. If I would be willing to say that the man they made the deal with didn't do it, I could go free that night and have a steak dinner. A steak dinner. I guess they forgot I was a vegetarian. I wasn't tempted. So I told them, it was as if they had taken everything from me. It was as if they wanted my integrity, the last thing I had left. It was like they wanted my soul. And I wasn't going to give it up. Because by then I knew that wherever I lived, I had to live with myself. And I could live with myself better in prison with my integrity than I could if I made such a deal and was on the outside. I wanted to be free because I wanted to be with my children who are now grown-ups. My daughter was almost 18 by then. My son was married and had a 3.5-year-old daughter of his own, with whom I'd never spent a whole day. So I refused the deal and I was sent back to prison. And I had my moment of doubt, like my distant relative, Jesus, whose mother Mary is the most famous Jewish woman in the world. And my friend Maria from Colombia said to me, Sonia, you did the right thing. You're going to go home. It's going to be okay. I said, I hope you're right, Maria. From your lips to God's ears. And so a few days later, on a Friday, they called me back to court. Now, everybody was convinced I was going home because they don't take you back to court on a Friday because they don't want to be responsible for you over the weekend. They lined the walkways, telling me, you're going home. Oh, you're going home. You're going to see your children. And I gave away all my possessions with the caveat that if I did come back, I wanted certain things back. And so they took me to court and they took me, and now you have to have not only handcuffs, but the handcuffs are attached to a waist chain. So your handcuffs are attached to this chain that's around your body. And then you have the shackles on your feet. And I sat in that van on the way back to court, and I felt as if I could feel my parents and Jesse around me. It was the most amazing thing. And then we got to court, and they take me in a little room next to the courtroom, And my lawyers came in and said, listen, they're offering you another deal. This time, they're offering you that if you will agree to what's called was an Alford plea, it means that you can go home today. You don't have to plead guilty, but they have to read into the record a conviction of a lesser degree for time served. And then they get to say all the bad things that they might have presented at trial without you being able to defend yourself at all. And you have to be silent and let them say all these bad things. So, and they said I had 10 minutes to decide. They also told me that as dirty as they were in the first trial, that they would probably be more so because now their reputations were at stake. And the word out among the, I guess it's, as you say, out on the street was that they had already found a new false witness for my new trial, and that she was going to get a white couch for her living room as a reward for testifying. You have 10 minutes to decide. So I sat there. Now, when this happened to me, I was 27 years old. I was a mother of 2 young children, a wife, and a daughter. When I was sitting there trying to make this decision, I was an orphan and a widow and a grandmother, and I was 45 years old. I had made a life for myself in the prison. I taught reading for the functionally illiterate. I taught math. I taught yoga, because when I was released from death row, all the prisoners wanted to know, how did I stay so healthy? How did I stay so mentally, physically, every way? And so I showed them. So I kind of inadvertently became a yoga teacher. And there's a little story connected to that. And I have a number of stories I want to tell you, my little Jewish stories. Naranda, the yoga Swami from Broward County, used to come in, and she became my mentor and my teacher. Her real name was Edith Epstein. And so she actually certified me to teach just before I left the prison. I could make a life in there. My children were grown, but it'd be nice to be able to spend some time at least with my grandchild. And I just felt that at that point, I could do more good outside than I could inside. So I decided, as long as I didn't have to plead guilty to something I didn't do, as long as I could maintain my integrity, I would accept. Now, there was no such thing as compensation, particularly in those days. I mean, it was theoretically, possible, but nobody ever got it. There wasn't such a thing as exoneree. The word didn't even exist. There was no such word as exoneree. I think I was the next person after Alford to actually have this plea used in my case. And so I decided I would accept, as long as I could maintain my innocence. So we went to court. They read all these terrible things into the record. I was given my papers that said I was free and told to have a nice life. They gave me my little box, my little cardboard box with everything I owned in the world. And they said, have a nice life, and opened the door. Anyway, we don't have time for all the stories. Again, it's in the book. But I'd like to share with you, I'm not sure. Larry, tell me how many minutes I have. How are we doing in time?
You can keep going. Actually, Jim, you should let me know, because I'm sure that there will be some questions. And
Yes,
I
I
am.
want to.
So, and But why don't you go on but
You-
I also want to be sure, Sonny, that you talk about what you and Peter are doing now. We've heard how
Yes.
you and Peter got together in Peter's video. What you're doing now, and also what is to me a wonderful, wonderful project that you have established in the state of Florida, in Tampa. So I want to make sure that you save yourself enough time, but go ahead where you were.
Yeah,
Okay.
and sorry, son, just quickly, I mean, normally we like to keep these to an hour just because people get zoomed out. And I would say if people are zoomed out, feel free to drop off and let's just plan to go as long as you have the energy with the target of being done by noon.
Okay, so give me a heads up at least so we save 10 minutes for questions, okay?
Yep.
Great, thanks.
That'd be
Okay.
great.
Okay, so there's some funny stories that I'd like to share with you to lighten it up a little bit. While I was, when I first, while I was still on death row, they'd let me go and meet with the other Jewish girls, which was the only contact I had with other prisoners for a while. And when the rabbi would come, and he would bring the bubbies would bring the food. I mean, you have to have food. It's a Jewish holiday, right? So we had a number of other women who decided they would like to be Jewish because of the food. And we would have our little holidays, and especially Passover was most special because they would bring matzah and I would have matzah. So my Christian friends would, I would give them, I would share the matzah with them so they could recreate the Last Supper, because at the Last Supper, they had matzah because the Last Supper was Passover. So it was an interesting connection. And I would get to tell the stories like at Hanukkah of the lights, because Hanukkah and Christmas again coincided. So it was really special, and it was a chance to bring everybody together on common ground, which was very, very nice. Then without Rabbi Richter, I don't think I actually would have gotten to my parents' funeral, which was one of the most important things for me. He was a great little man, and he always played the guitar. He always brought the guitar, and we'd sing songs. And he made sure that after the fast, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that we would have food to eat. And there were very few Jewish girls, of course, in the prison. And then when I was released, again, Rabbi Richter, we stayed in touch, and he was my advisor still until he passed away. He remained my advisor. And my friend Nikki's father, when he passed away, Rabbi Richter took me to the cemetery, and it was a really beautiful and interesting ride together, because for the first time we actually were together free, and we talked about how it was for him to have to come visit me in the prison. So it was a very interesting relationship that we developed and maintained until he passed away not that long ago. And now in Ireland, I think it was Larry reminded, or maybe it was Jim reminded me, there used to be a very large Jewish population in Ireland. And now you know I got to Ireland. Well, how did I get to Ireland? Because of Peter. So I want to tell you the story of how the Jews got to Ireland. So they were from Lithuania, I believe, and they got on a boat. It was the late 1800s, I think, to go to America. Nobody spoke any English, of course. So at the time, the last stop before America was in Cork, at the very southern tip of Ireland. So the boat pulls into Cork and they announce with the loudspeaker, anybody, the Queenstown, Cork, anybody getting off the boat at Queenstown, Cork? And they heard Queens, New York. So they got off the boat. And that's how they got to Ireland. So there was a very large community of Jews in Cork. And then, of course, they migrated rather to Dublin, the next biggest city. And so there were two very large Jewish populations with synagogues and everything in Ireland. But because Ireland went through some very difficult times, they immigrated for the most part. And now there are only about 1,000 Jews in Ireland. I think I made 1,001. And I was saying, I think I may have one of the only mezuzahs in the west of Ireland today. But I used to make poor Peter, used to have to drive me, like it was in those days, 4 hours to Dublin so I could go to the synagogue for the holidays. But I've reverted back to the way that I used to do when I was locked up. And I make my own holidays. I get my candles sent to me by friends. And I make my holidays. But Rabbi Rechter told me a story. He said that there used to be a special place in the woods where the people would go and they'd say special words, special prayers in this special place and light the candles. But after a while, they forgot the special place, but they still said the special words and lit the special candles. And then they forgot the words, but they still light the candles. But it still has the same meaning. So that's what I do. I might not use exactly the right words, and I might not go to the special place, but I think the special place is in here. And I still feel connected. It doesn't matter how far away I am, because I learned in my death row cell that I'm always connected. I'm never alone. And in that way, I participate and I remain connected. And so I've taught that to my children as well. When I was released, I went I couldn't go anywhere really. I mean, my friend Nikki took me, was like my guide through the universe, took me to visit my son. And I spent the day with my granddaughter for the first time. And she said to me, Grandma, I know why you never came to visit me, because you were lost. And I said, that's right, Claudia, but I'll never be lost again. And then I went to visit my daughter in the special school where she was being held. And I could only hope that her curiosity would lead her to me someday. And then I went and my son told me I'd always have a home with him. But he was living way out in the sticks because he had lost all faith in society by that time. And, but that gave me courage. I did want to see a little bit more of the world before I retired to the sticks. So I decided to take up my friend's offer and go to LA, Disneyland, the land of opportunity. And nobody would hire me. Who's hiring a 45-year-old woman with my work record? So I hired myself. I became a yoga teacher. And I did every odd job you could imagine to try to make money. And the first thing I did when I could afford to was buy myself a van, because I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, I'd always have some place to live. This was my mindset at the time. Finally, my daughter was released from the school when she was 18, and she eventually did come and find me, and we got an apartment together. And then my son's marriage broke up, and he came with his daughter to live with us, and we did become a family again, which is rare. Most people who have been through the experience like I have been find it very difficult to reconnect with their family because too much time has gone by, and maybe the family didn't believe in them and wasn't supportive, and they feel guilty once they find out that really the person was innocent. So it's difficult. And I was able to pass on at least what I wanted to pass on, a legacy of hope and healing and forgiveness to my children, rather than anger and bitterness and looking for some compensation from somewhere. Because although it's true nowadays that it is possible to get compensation, that compensation doesn't help you heal. It makes life a little easier, but it doesn't make you heal. And that's why Peter and I started the Sunny Center Foundation, because we had both dedicated ourselves to healing and to forgiveness and had become part of each other's healing process. So we wanted to share that with others who had been through a similar experience. Because even to this day, there is not one college course that teaches you how to work with exonerees. Nothing yet. That's something we're working on now. And I'm going to need probably some help to make it professional. We have the experience, but I need to put it into some professional form so that we can create a manual or a book of some sort to help teach people to do what we do, because we're older now and we would like this work to go on beyond our capacity to carry it forward. And so that's why I'm so thankful to Larry, who has put together all of the talks that Peter has given online on the internet. That'll be a really good tool for us. And we have volunteers come to the Healing Center. The Healing Center is our home in Ireland. We have a home in New York where we do most of the what you call networking. And of course, at the Innocence Project network conferences. And we have the Living Center in Tampa, thanks to the people having belief enough in us to put together the funds to purchase the property. We have 4 little houses where we can offer newly released exonerees a place where they can decompress, where they can feel comfortable with other exonerees that have been through the same thing and understand what they're going through. And we help them with their healing there. Most recently, for the past couple of years, we've had to do that remotely, using the Zoom and the internet, but it works. And we feel very blessed to be able to do that. So I think I should leave it open to some questions, maybe, or comments or whatever. And so I'm ready.
Great. Well, thank you, Sunny.
Sure.
A couple of questions have come in. One of them was there a separate jury that dealt with the punishment phase of your trial? Was that the same jury that dealt with the actual trial?
Well, that's a good question. It's a bifurcated trial, which means it's in 2 separate parts, but it's the same jury. So I had a separate trial from Jesse. In his trial, it lasted 4 days, tried, convicted, sentenced to death without a shred of evidence. My trial lasted longer. It was 2 weeks. They actually brought in a young woman that they found in the jail and told her that if she could help them convict me, she and her boyfriend could be released the next day. But if not, she would go to prison for a long time. Her life would be ruined and she'd never get back to university. So she came. And so that was about all they had, aside from the other guy, the killer. And so my jurors and my judge had been a highway patrolman before he was a judge. And we had asked him to step down from the case because we didn't feel he could be impartial in a case that involved policemen, but he refused to do so. And in fact, he was the judge on all 3 cases. And so it was as a result of his explanation of the law that the jurors felt they had no choice but to convict on what they had heard. My appointed lawyer decided we shouldn't put up any defense. It would give him a better position in the closing arguments. That's what he said. And hey, he's the lawyer. I'm not worried about anything. I'm innocent. So that's what we did. You should always defend yourself. Always take the stand in your own defense, because otherwise it looks like you're hiding something. I didn't know that. So the jurors were not convinced. And even though they felt that according to his explanation of the law, they had no choice but to convict me, they weren't all convinced that I was guilty. And there was one juror in particular who held out against the pressure of the other jurors to be unanimous. In those days, they couldn't give a death sentence without being unanimous. And so I really owe him my life, because he stood up for what he believed. They said, look, then he took the time and the effort. After I was released, this man in Bermuda shorts comes to my friend's house where I was living and says he wants to apologize to me, that he was a juror at my trial. Now, this is bizarre. So, okay, come in, sit down. And he told me what happened in the jury room. They wanted him to agree to sentence me to death because, number one, they wanted to make an example of a woman to show that if you come to Florida and you kill somebody, you go in an electric chair. Number two, because I was writing the entire time of my trial because I didn't understand what was going on. I have questions. Why can't we just get up and say he's lying? We can't do that. We just have to sit here and let him lie. And we're not going to say anything. My court-appointed lawyer said, write all your questions down. I'll answer them later. You don't want to make a bad impression on the jury if you keep interrupting. He never answered my questions. So they thought I was going to write a book and make money from the crime. So that's the second reason to sentence me to death. The third reason was they were tired and hungry. They'd been sequestered for 2 weeks and they wanted to go home. That's reason number three. So thank God he didn't give in. I think his name was Goldman. And so as a result, my jury had to sentence me to life. And that's what happened in the actual sentencing phase. And then the judge overruled them.
The judge had a nickname, didn't he, Sonny?
Yes, Maximum Dan. He was the hanging judge, and they say that he had a little miniature electric chair on his desk, which actually worked. It could go zip, zip, zip. Jesus.
So, Sonny / Larry, this question came up and we also talked about both Sonny, your book, and Peter's book, and maybe we can send a note out to everybody after this. But the question was, how can I contribute financially to your quest? And if we can answer that easily now, great. And if not, we'll include it in the email to all the attendees.
Okay, well, that would be a good idea. I think the website is sunnycenter.org. Okay. And yep, that's spelled right. And there you can find the books, and there you can, say you want the books, and there also you can contribute financially. We also, always need people who maybe can contribute in other ways. There are many ways. Sometimes people need things. Sometimes they could take somebody to a sports game. Sometimes, people have extra stuff that they could donate, for the living center. So if a doctor or a dentist, you get out of prison after so many years, especially if you were sentenced to death, and you need a dentist and you need a doctor and you need a psychologist. And we are working actually with social workers now and psychologists to try to help them to understand the particular needs of exonerees. So there's many ways to contribute. Air miles, when we can have people come again, that'll be an important contribution. But mainly right now, yes, it's true. Funds are hard to come by, and we could definitely use them. I appreciate that question.
Sonny, and while you're mentioning that, there are two centers of operation right now for the Sunny Center. One is in the home that you are occupying in Ireland, in which you house newly exonerated prisoners. When you talk about donating miles, it's miles that will help get these new exonerees in the United States over to spend a month or 2 months at your house so that you can acclimate them back into society. But the other thing is this project right here within a few hours of Naples in Tampa, which is a wonderful project that started only a few years ago. It's 4 small houses, very small houses, all located on the same lot. And it is now occupied, each of them is occupied by a different exoneree, and they stay there for a period of time and then they get replaced by other exonerees. It's just a wonderful opportunity for them to be back in society, but also in the company of people who understand what they've been through because they've lived the same experience as them.
Yeah, and I have to tell you two needs we have there. And one of them is that we have an outreach coordinator there, and she helps them. First of all, they have to get identification. You have no ID when you come out. And these days with the pandemic, it's harder even than it used to be to get ID because there's no office you can go to. It takes much longer. There's more bureaucratic paperwork to go through, and you can't see a human being. So she helps them get their ID. She helps them establish a bank account. She helps them to get on SSI with also the thing for disability, because they have PTSD that is beyond the actual definition of PTSD. And so she guides them through their first months of being free. She helps them to reconnect with their family. She helps them. She gets them to go to a counselor. It's a requirement. If you're going to live in the Sunny Center Living Center, you have to see a counselor at least 3 times, so that when you have a crisis in your reconnecting with the world, that there's somebody that you're familiar with, that that knows you. So so she guides them through this whole time, and then she takes them to their doctor appointments because they can't deal with authority. They freeze. They can't be in a crowd because it's too overwhelming. So she has to guide them through, and she is essential to the work, and we have to pay her. She has to have a decent salary. So that's one of the reasons that we do need donations. Another thing we really need is housing. When we move them on, Larry, that when you said that, it made me realize I need to explain that one of our biggest needs is for when they're going to be moved on from the Sunny Living Center in Tampa, we need affordable housing, because they get basically $750 a month. So what's rent? How are you going to live? You can't even afford, a movie on $750 a month. They get food stamps. Wonderful. Doesn't cover everything. If they need to get to a doctor appointment and have to take an Uber, then they can't even afford it. So what we're working on is we need to find people who have housing that would be willing to dedicate maybe some apartment or whatever they have to exonerees. And the Innocence Project does help pay some of the rent in some cases, but there are some who didn't come out through the Innocence Project. If you don't have DNA, the Innocence Project, it doesn't usually work on your case. And I must say, most women don't have DNA involved in their case. There's no rape. There's no bloody murder. So for most women, that doesn't help. I think there are, of the 2,800 and whatever that you mentioned, I think there are 200 and some women. There's less than 10% women.
Yeah.
Okay, that's terrible. Women are more than 10% of the population in prison. Anyway, so housing is a big deal. We're looking for, maybe because of the situation in the last couple of years, maybe a hotel or motel that isn't being used anymore, that maybe we would be allowed to work on and convert into little apartments. So we can have moving on housing for people who are ready to leave, because with only 4 spots, it's hard for us to accommodate the need, and the need is growing because the Innocence Projects are getting better and better at getting people out. More and more people are aware that there is such a thing as wrongful conviction. So that's our main need in Tampa.
Great. One other question that I think we have time for, and just before I forget, as we said up front, this session has been recorded. It should be available on the MCA site later this week, hopefully Thursday, Friday. So if anybody wants to replay it, you can easily go to the MCA site, and you need to be an MCA member in order to have access to that. So if there's people on the call who aren't MCA members, go to your MCA friend who invited you or husband who invited you, and you'll be able to see this as a recording. The last question that I want to pose before we break came through, and the question is, do you or did you have any recourse in the wrongful execution of your husband?
Good question. I tried for the first few years. I got absorbed by the anti-death penalty movement. And everywhere I spoke, I made an appeal. If there's anybody in the audience, any lawyer in the audience who can help me to file a suit for wrongful death, against the state of Florida for Jesse's execution, please come up afterwards. Nobody ever came. And then somebody finally took pity on me and told me, because there was a $100,000 cap on suing the state of Florida, and that would not cover the cost of the lawsuit, and end of the story. So we didn't. Now, there may be a way for someone to sue on behalf of the children. I don't know. Certainly what was done to my son was completely illegal. But we've never pursued it, and they are so traumatized to this day. My son developed a speech impediment because of his treatment there as a 9-year-old. And to this day, if he has to go to a job interview or anything that involves authority, it comes back. So I don't think it would be worth putting him through it. Maybe, I don't know, but I've never pursued it. So it's no, there was apparently nothing we could do. Maybe someday, if there's time, we're so busy saving the ones that are still alive, maybe it could be taken up as a cause to show that he was wrongfully executed, but I don't see that happening.
Sonny, thank you so much. I have to just share this quick story on how stupid I am, because when I did the intro and putting this together, I saw the Sonny Sender Foundation in Tampa, and I thought Sonny as in sunshine. I didn't think Sonny as in you, and I apologize. I didn't put 2 and 2 together on that.
No, we did. It's supposed to be that double entendre, like it is supposed to be sunny.
Well, it was a single entendre for me, because it sort of went right over my head. But thank you so much for spending this time and sharing your story with us. It was absolutely fascinating. And Larry, thanks for bringing this to us, and all the work that you've done on this, amazing cause, and just getting awareness out. That's the first thing. Someone told me that one of the great things about Naples is that for any kind of funding that you need, you can raise funds in Naples. So hopefully from this Zoom and from people talking about it, we'll be able to get some contribution into the Sonny Center
Thank you.
up in Tampa. But
And
again,
thank you, Larry and Joanne. They are our mentors, and I'm so glad they connected us with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I think everyone can see why both of us just simply adore both you and Peter.
Yeah, he's my sweetie. I can't wait for him to get home.
Incidentally, he just celebrated his birthday last week.
83rd birthday.
Yep.
Yeah,
Great.
that's why we're so anxious to work on passing this on. It's a very precious time of life that we have now. It's the end of our days. And we want to be able to spend more of it just being together and not working all the time. So that's my quest now, is to try to get that work done and just keep on enjoying life.
That's great.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone, for attending. And again, thanks to you, Sonny and Larry, for sharing this story with us. Much
Peace
appreciated.
is the way, love is the answer.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.